Sarah Martinez stepped off the Greyhound bus in the small town of Millfield, Texas, carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag and the weight of 15 years of military service on her shoulders. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt of the bus station parking lot. At 35, she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen combat in 3 different countries, but, to the casual observer, she looked like just another woman trying to start over. The town seemed frozen in time, with its main street lined with businesses that had seen better days. A few locals sat outside the diner, their curious eyes following her as she walked past. Sarah had chosen Millfield specifically because it was the kind of place where nobody asked too many questions about your past. After losing her husband in Afghanistan and spending the last 2 years fighting her own demons, she needed somewhere to disappear and heal. She found the small apartment she had rented sight unseen above Murphy's hardware store. The elderly landlord, Frank Murphy, met her at the side entrance with a set of keys and a weathered smile. He had served in Vietnam and recognized something familiar in her bearing, though he was too polite to pry. "Welcome to Millfield, Miss Martinez," Frank said, handing her the keys. "It's not much, but it's quiet. Most folks around here mind their own business." Sarah nodded her thanks and climbed the narrow stairs to her new home. The apartment was small but clean, with a kitchenette, a living area barely big enough for a couch, and a bedroom that overlooked the main street. She set her bag down and surveyed her new surroundings. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. The next morning, Sarah ventured out to explore the town and pick up some basic supplies. The local grocery store, Palmer's Market, was run by a family that had been in Millfield for 3 generations. As she navigated the narrow aisles, she overheard conversations about the usual small-town concerns, the high school football team's chances this season, the upcoming county fair, and complaints about the group of troublemakers who had been causing problems around town. "Those Hendricks boys are at it again," she heard an elderly woman tell the cashier. "Saw them yesterday harassing that new teacher outside the school. Someone needs to teach them some manners before they really hurt somebody." Sarah filed the information away without much thought. She had dealt with bullies before, both in the military and in her civilian life. Every town had them. She paid for her groceries and headed home, planning to spend the rest of the day settling in. That evening, she decided to take a walk around town to get her bearings. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Most of the businesses were closed, but she could see lights on in the diner and hear the distant sound of music coming from what appeared to be the local bar. As she walked past the high school, she noticed a young woman sitting alone on the front steps, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Sarah's protective instincts, honed by years of military service and her own experiences as a woman in a male-dominated field, immediately kicked in. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, approaching slowly so as not to startle the girl. The young woman looked up, revealing tear-streaked cheeks and a bruise forming on her left temple. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with short brown hair and the kind of earnest face that suggested she was probably the town's new teacher the grocery store customers had mentioned. "I'm fine," the woman said quickly, though her voice betrayed her distress. "Just having a rough day." Sarah sat down on the steps beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "I'm Sarah Martinez. I just moved to town yesterday. And you don't look fine, if you don't mind me saying so." The young woman hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I'm Emily Chen. I started teaching here 3 weeks ago. It's just, some of the locals haven't exactly rolled out the welcome mat." Sarah studied the bruise on Emily's temple more closely. In her military experience, she had seen enough injuries to recognize the distinctive mark left by knuckles. "Did someone hit you?" Emily's hand instinctively moved to cover the bruise. "It was an accident. I was walking home from the school board meeting tonight, and these 3 guys, they were drinking, and they said some things. When I tried to walk away, one of them grabbed my arm. I pulled free and stumbled into a wall." The story didn't add up, and Sarah's expression must have conveyed her skepticism because Emily quickly continued. "Really, it was just a misunderstanding. They're not bad guys, just young and stupid. I probably shouldn't have been walking alone after dark. Sarah had heard variations of this excuse countless times, both from fellow service members who had been assaulted and from civilians she had encountered during her deployments. The tendency to blame oneself or minimize the aggressor's actions was a common response to trauma. "What did they say to you?" Sarah asked gently. Emily looked uncomfortable. "Just things about me being an outsider. About how someone like me doesn't belong in a place like this. They used some words I'd rather not repeat." Sarah felt a familiar anger building in her chest, the same righteous fury that had driven her through some of the toughest moments of her military career. She had seen firsthand what happened when good people stood by and did nothing while bullies terrorized the vulnerable. "Have you reported this to the police?" Sarah asked. Emily laughed bitterly. "The police?" "The sheriff's department consists of exactly two people, Sheriff Watson, who's been here for 30 years and is friends with everyone's family, and his deputy, Mike Hendricks." The name clicked. Hendricks? Like the troublemakers I heard people talking about at the grocery store. Mike's the oldest of the three brothers. The other two are Tommy and Jake. Their father owns the biggest ranch in the county, and their mother's family has been here since the town was founded. They basically run this place. Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I came here because I thought I could make a difference, help kids get a better education. But maybe I was naive." Sarah had encountered similar power dynamics in various places around the world. Small communities where certain families held disproportionate influence, where corruption and intimidation went unchecked because everyone was either too afraid or too invested in the status quo to speak up. "How long have they been bothering you?" Sarah asked. "It started my second day here. I was setting up my classroom when they showed up, said they wanted to welcome the new teacher. They made some crude comments about what they could teach me. I thought if I just ignored them, they'd get bored and leave me alone." Emily's voice grew quieter. "But it's been getting worse. Today was the first time one of them actually put his hands on me." Sarah's military training had taught her to gather intelligence before taking action. She needed to understand the full scope of the problem before deciding how to respond. "Tell me about tonight. What exactly happened?" Emily took a shaky breath. "I was walking home from the school board meeting around 8 o'clock. It was getting dark, but it's only a few blocks from the school to my apartment. I've made that walk dozens of times without any problems. But tonight, they were waiting for me in the parking lot behind the hardware store." Sarah's apartment was above that same hardware store. She had probably been upstairs, unpacking her belongings, while Emily was being assaulted just below. All three of them were there, drunk and acting even more aggressive than usual. Tommy, the middle brother, blocked my path when I tried to walk around them. He started saying things about how I needed to learn my place in this town, how outsiders who don't show proper respect needed to be taught lessons. Emily's hands were shaking now as she relived the encounter. Sarah reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder, offering silent support. "I told them I just wanted to go home, but Jake, the youngest one, said I wasn't going anywhere until I apologized for being disrespectful to their family. I didn't even know what I was supposed to apologize for. When I tried to step around Tommy, he shoved me back. That's when Mike came up behind me and..." Emily's voice broke. "Take your time," Sarah said softly. "He grabbed my arms and held them behind my back while Tommy got right in my face. He was saying awful things about what they could do to me, how no one would believe me if I tried to report it. Then, Jake said something about teaching me a lesson I'd never forget, and he kneed me in the ribs." Sarah's jaw tightened. The casual violence, the coordinated intimidation, the sexual threats, it all painted a picture of predators who had grown comfortable operating with impunity. The pain was so intense I couldn't breathe for a moment. When Mike finally let go of my arms, I stumbled and hit my head against the brick wall. They all just laughed and walked away like it was some kind of joke." Emily was crying again now. I sat there in that alley for 20 minutes before I could even stand up straight. Sarah had heard enough. The tactical part of her brain was already formulating plans, considering options, assessing threats. But the human part of her, the part that remembered what it felt like to be vulnerable and afraid, simply wanted to offer comfort. "Have you seen a doctor about your ribs?" Sarah asked. Emily shook her head. "The closest hospital is 45 minutes away, and I don't have a car. Besides, I don't think anything's broken. It just hurts to breathe deeply." Sarah made a mental note to check on Emily's injuries properly once they got somewhere with better lighting. Broken ribs could be dangerous if left untreated, and the fact that Emily was downplaying her injuries was concerning. "Do you have family you can call? Someone who could come help you?" "My parents live in California. They already think I'm crazy for taking a teaching job in the middle of nowhere. If I tell them about this, they'll just insist I come home." Emily looked defeated. "Maybe they are right. Maybe I should just quit and leave." The defeatist tone in Emily's voice struck a chord with Sarah. She had seen too many good people driven away by bullies, too many communities that suffered because decent individuals were afraid to stand up to local power structures. "How many other people have they done this to?" Sarah asked. Emily considered the question. "There was a woman last year who tried to open a coffee shop downtown. She left after a few months of harassment. And, before that, a family moved here because the husband got a job at the grain elevator. They had teenage daughters, and, after a few months of problems with the Hendricks boys, they packed up and left town. The pattern was clear. The Hendricks brothers were systematically driving away anyone who might challenge their control or simply anyone they viewed as different. It was a classic small-town power play, enabled by family connections and community complacency. What about other teachers? Other women in town? Are you the only one they target? Most of the other teachers have been here for years. They know how to avoid the Hendricks boys, know not to be out alone after dark, know not to challenge them publicly. The women who grew up here just accept it as the way things are." Emily's voice carried a note of despair. "I'm starting to think they're right. Maybe this is just how small towns work." Sarah had spent enough time in small communities around the world to know that this wasn't normal or acceptable. Healthy communities protected their vulnerable members and held bullies accountable. What Emily was describing was a community that had allowed fear to override basic human decency. "You said the sheriff is friends with their family. What about other authorities? State police? County officials?" "The county seat is 2 hours away, and the state police barely patrol out here. Besides, what would I tell them? That some local boys roughed me up a little? They'd probably just refer it back to Sheriff Watson, and then I'd really be in trouble." Sarah understood Emily's reluctance to involve outside authorities. In tight-knit communities, being labeled a troublemaker or a snitch could have serious consequences. But the alternative, accepting systematic abuse, was unacceptable. "Emily, I want you to know that what happened to you tonight isn't okay. It's not normal, and it's not something you should have to accept or handle on your own." Sarah's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat zones. "No one has the right to put their hands on you or threaten you, regardless of their family connections or how long they've lived here." Emily looked up at Sarah with a mixture of gratitude and skepticism. "That's easy to say, but you don't know these people. You don't know how this town works." Sarah stood up and extended her hand to Emily. "Maybe not yet. But I'm a quick learner. Come on, let's get you somewhere safe where I can take a proper look at those injuries." As they walked toward Sarah's apartment, neither woman spoke. Emily was lost in her own thoughts, probably wondering if she had made a mistake by confiding in a stranger. Sarah was conducting a mental assessment of the situation, drawing on her military experience to analyze the threat level and consider potential responses. The Hendricks brothers had made a crucial error in judgment. They had assumed that Emily was alone and powerless, like their previous victims. They had no way of knowing that their latest target had just gained an ally with 15 years of military training, including specialized combat experience that most people couldn't even imagine. Sarah's apartment was spartanly furnished but clean and functional. She guided Emily to the small couch and switched on the overhead light to examine her injuries properly. Years of battlefield medicine training kicked in as she assessed the damage. "Can you lift your shirt a little? I need to check your ribs," Sarah said, her voice clinical but gentle. Emily hesitated for a moment, then pulled up the left side of her shirt to reveal an angry purple bruise spreading across her ribcage. Sarah's expression darkened as she recognized the distinctive pattern. This wasn't the result of a casual shove or accidental contact. Someone had deliberately and forcefully driven their knee into Emily's ribs with intent to cause maximum pain. "Take a deep breath for me," Sarah instructed, watching carefully as Emily complied with obvious discomfort. "Now exhale slowly." After a thorough examination, Sarah concluded that while the ribs were likely bruised rather than broken, Emily needed to be monitored for signs of internal injury. She retrieved a first aid kit from her duffel bag. A habit from her military days was to always travel with medical supplies. "You're lucky nothing seems to be broken, but this is going to hurt for a while. Ice will help with the swelling, and you need to avoid any strenuous activity for at least a week." Sarah handed Emily a bottle of water and 2 ibuprofen tablets. "More importantly, if you have any trouble breathing, chest pain, or dizziness, you need to get to a hospital immediately." Emily took the medication gratefully. "Thank you. I don't know why you're helping me, but I appreciate it more than you know." Sarah settled into the chair across from the couch, studying Emily's face. "I'm helping you because it's the right thing to do. And because I've seen what happens when good people do nothing while bullies run wild." "Are you a doctor?" Emily asked, noting the professional way Sarah had examined her injuries. "Military medic training," Sarah replied simply. "I spent some time in places where knowing how to treat injuries was a matter of life and death." Emily's eyes widened slightly. "You're a veteran?" "Navy. 15 years. Sarah didn't elaborate, but something in her tone suggested those 15 years had been eventful. Over the next hour, Emily found herself opening up to this quiet stranger who had shown her more kindness in one evening than she had experienced in 3 weeks in Millfield. She talked about her dreams of making a difference in education, her frustration with the school board's indifference to the harassment she faced, and her growing fear that the Hendricks brothers' behavior was escalating. "They are getting bolder," Emily explained. "At first, it was just comments and looks. Then, they started following me around town, making sure I saw them wherever I went. Last week, Jake cornered me at the grocery store and made some explicit suggestions about what I could do to fit in better with the community." Sarah listened without interruption, filing away every detail. In her military career, intelligence gathering had often been the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Understanding the enemy's patterns, motivations, and capabilities was essential for developing an effective response. "Tell me about the rest of the town. Are there other people who might be willing to help if they knew what was happening?" Emily considered the question. "Most people keep their heads down. Frank Murphy, your landlord, seems like a decent man, but he's in his 70s and probably can't do much. There's Dr. Patterson who runs the clinic, but she's only in town 2 days a week. Pastor Williams at the Methodist Church might be sympathetic, but the Hendricks family are major contributors to the church. What about other parents? People with daughters who might be future targets? That's the thing, most families with teenage daughters have already left town or sent their kids to boarding school. The ones who stay teach their daughters to avoid certain parts of town and never be alone with any of the Hendricks boys." Emily's voice was bitter. "It's like they've accepted that this is just the price of living here." Sarah had seen similar dynamics in villages controlled by local warlords or criminal organizations. Fear became so ingrained in the community that people forgot they had other options. They adapted to oppression instead of fighting it. "What about the school board? You mentioned a meeting tonight. 5 members, all men, all over 50, all with business or family connections to the Hendricks Ranch. When I brought up the harassment issue 3 weeks ago, they told me I was probably misinterpreting friendly behavior and suggested I try to be more welcoming to local customs. Emily's frustration was evident. They made it clear that my job security depended on not causing trouble. The picture was becoming clearer. The Hendricks family had systematically infiltrated or influenced every power structure in the community. They had created an environment where their behavior went unchallenged because challenging them meant risking economic and social suicide. But Sarah had operated in environments where the stakes were much higher than job security or social acceptance. She had faced down armed insurgents, corrupt officials, and hostile foreign governments. A family of small-town bullies, no matter how entrenched their power, didn't intimidate her. The next morning, Sarah began her reconnaissance in earnest. She walked the town systematically, noting key locations, escape routes, and potential strategic advantages. She observed the daily routines of various residents, paying particular attention to the Hendricks brothers' movements and habits. The town was larger than it had initially appeared, with several residential neighborhoods spreading out from the main commercial district. The Hendricks ranch occupied a significant portion of the land to the west, with the family's imposing two-story house visible from several points in town. Their wealth and influence were evident in the quality of their vehicles, their clothing, and the deference shown to them by local business owners. Sarah positioned herself at Murphy's Diner around lunchtime, having learned that this was when the brothers typically made their daily appearance in town. She ordered coffee and a sandwich, taking a seat that offered a clear view of the street while keeping her back to a wall, another ingrained habit from her military service. At precisely 12:30, a large pickup truck pulled up outside the diner. 3 men climbed out, their swagger and entitled demeanor marking them immediately as the Hendricks brothers. Mike, the oldest, was tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of confident bearing that came from never being seriously challenged. Tommy, the middle brother, was leaner but moved with a predatory grace that suggested he enjoyed the intimidation game. Jake, the youngest, appeared to be trying to compensate for his smaller stature with aggressive body language and a perpetual sneer. They entered the diner like they owned it, which, Sarah reflected, they probably did in all the ways that mattered. The other patrons either nodded respectfully or pointedly avoided eye contact. The waitress, a woman in her 40s who moved with nervous efficiency, immediately approached their table with coffee before they had even sat down. "Afternoon, boys," she said with forced cheerfulness. "The usual?" "Make it quick, Janet," Mike replied without looking at her. "We've got business to take care of this afternoon." Sarah studied their interaction carefully. The casual dismissiveness, the expectation of immediate service, the way they talked over and around the waitress as if she were invisible, it all confirmed what Emily had told her about their sense of entitlement. As they ate, Sarah caught fragments of their conversation. They were discussing someone's attitude problem and debating whether stronger measures were necessary. While they didn't mention Emily by name, the context made it clear they were planning their next move against her. "That little teacher needs to understand how things work around here," Tommy was saying. "Daddy's getting tired of hearing complaints about our hospitality." Jake laughed. "Maybe she needs a more personal welcome. I've got some ideas about how to make her feel at home." The crude implication was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her jaw tighten. These weren't just bullies, they were escalating toward sexual assault, and they were discussing it openly in a public place because they knew no one would challenge them. Mike seemed to be the strategic thinker of the group. "We need to be smart about this. No more public confrontations where people might see." "Janet, is Miss Chen still renting that apartment above the old bookstore?" The waitress glanced around nervously before nodding. "Far as I know, yes." "Good. Nice and isolated back there. Perfect for a private conversation." Mike's smile was predatory. "Tomorrow night should work perfectly." Sarah had heard enough. The brothers were planning to escalate their harassment to Emily's home, where they could operate without witnesses. In her experience, when predators talked about private conversations and personal welcomes, violence was inevitable. She finished her meal and left the diner without attracting attention, but her mind was already working on the tactical problem. 3 against 1 would normally favor the attackers, especially on their home territory where they had support from local authorities. But Sarah had significant advantages they couldn't anticipate. First, they had no idea she existed or that Emily had an ally. Second, they were overconfident from years of operating without serious opposition. Third, their planning was sloppy and their operational security was non-existent. Discussing criminal plans in public demonstrated the kind of arrogance that led to tactical mistakes. Most importantly, they were civilians who had probably never faced real violence in their lives. Their intimidation tactics worked against vulnerable targets like Emily, but they had no experience with someone who had been trained to fight and kill in actual combat situations. That afternoon, Sarah made several strategic purchases at various stores around town. She bought rope and duct tape at the hardware store, a digital camera at the electronics shop, and a small voice recorder at the office supply store. She paid cash for everything and spread her purchases across multiple locations to avoid drawing attention. She also spent time studying the layout around Emily's apartment building. The old bookstore was located on a side street with minimal foot traffic after business hours. The building had a rear entrance that accessed the upstairs apartment directly, and the alley behind it was poorly lit and largely hidden from view. It was, as Mike had noted, perfect for a private conversation, but that isolation could work both ways. That evening, Sarah knocked on Emily's door with a bag of groceries and a carefully planned story. "I was at the store anyway and thought you might not feel up to shopping with those sore ribs," Sarah explained when Emily answered the door. Emily was clearly touched by the gesture. "You didn't have to do that, but thank you. I was actually dreading the thought of walking to the store." As Sarah helped Emily put away the groceries, she carefully steered the conversation toward security concerns. "Have you thought about getting some additional locks for your door? This is an old building, and those original locks probably wouldn't stop a determined intruder." Emily paused in unpacking a bag. "Are you worried about something specific?" Sarah had debated how much to tell Emily about what she had overheard at the diner. Too much information might panic her, but too little might leave her unprepared for what was coming. "I did some shopping downtown today and got the impression that the Hendricks brothers were still talking about you. Nothing specific, but I think it would be smart to take some precautions for a few days." Emily's face paled. "What kind of precautions?" "Basic security measures. Better locks, maybe stay with a friend for a few nights, avoid being alone after dark." Sarah kept her tone casual, not wanting to alarm Emily unnecessarily. "It's probably nothing, but there's no harm in being careful. I don't really have any friends here yet, and I can't afford a hotel." Emily looked worried. "Do you think they're planning to do something?" Sarah had made her decision. Emily deserved to know what she was facing, even if it meant revealing more about Sarah's own capabilities than she had intended. "Emily, I need to tell you something. I overheard them at the diner today, and they are planning to come here tomorrow night. They want to have a private conversation with you about your attitude problem." Emily sat down heavily on her couch, her face going white. "Oh God. What am I going to do? I can't fight 3 grown men. I can't even run, my ribs still hurt too much." "You won't have to fight them," Sarah said firmly. "But I need to know if you trust me." Emily looked up at her with desperate hope. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I have skills they don't know about, and I've dealt with bullies like this before. If you're willing to let me help, I can make sure they never bother you again." Sarah's voice was calm but carried an undertone of steel that made Emily pay attention. "But you need to understand that once we go down this path, there's no going back. Things are going to change in this town, one way or another." Emily studied Sarah's face, seeing something there that hadn't been visible before, a kind of controlled intensity that spoke of experience with violence and a complete confidence in her ability to handle it. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that tomorrow night, when they come here expecting to find a scared teacher they can intimidate, they're going to find something very different." Sarah's smile was cold and predatory. "I'm suggesting that it's time someone taught the Hendricks brothers that actions have consequences." Sarah spent the next morning conducting final preparations with a methodical precision that had kept her alive through multiple combat deployments. She had decided against involving Emily directly in the confrontation. The young teacher was untrained and still injured, making her more of a liability than an asset in a tactical situation. Instead, Sarah's plan relied on careful positioning, superior training, and the element of complete surprise. The Hendricks brothers expected to find a vulnerable woman alone in her apartment. They would instead encounter a former Navy SEAL with 15 years of combat experience and nothing left to lose. At 10 a.m., Sarah visited Emily's apartment one final time to go over the plan. "I need you to pack a bag and stay with Pastor Williams tonight," Sarah explained. "Tell him you've received some threats and need a safe place to stay. Most pastors won't turn away someone asking for sanctuary." Emily looked uncomfortable with the deception. "What if he asks for details?" "Tell him the truth, that some men have been harassing you and you're afraid they might escalate. You don't have to mention that we're expecting them tonight." Sarah handed Emily a small device. "This is a voice recorder. Keep it with you and turn it on if anyone asks you questions about what happened. Having documentation might be important later." "What exactly is going to happen tonight?" Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah had debated how much to reveal about her intentions. Emily deserved to know that Sarah wasn't planning to simply scare the brothers away, but detailed explanations about tactical operations weren't necessary. "I'm going to have a conversation with them about their behavior and help them understand why targeting you was a mistake. After tonight, they won't be bothering you anymore." Emily searched Sarah's face for clues about what this conversation might entail. "You're not going to do anything illegal, are you?" "I'm going to defend myself and protect an innocent person from assault. Everything I do will be in response to their actions." Sarah's answer was technically truthful, though she knew the reality would be more complex. "Emily, these men were planning to sexually assault you tonight. They've been escalating their behavior for weeks, and they've made it clear that they intend to hurt you. Someone has to stop them." The weight of Sarah's words settled over Emily like a cold blanket. She had been trying to minimize the threat, to convince herself that the harassment wouldn't escalate beyond verbal intimidation. But Sarah's blunt assessment forced her to confront the reality of her situation. "How do you know they were planning to do that?" "Because I've seen this pattern before, in war zones and civilian situations. Predators follow predictable escalation patterns. They start with verbal harassment, progress to physical intimidation, then move to isolated attacks when they are confident they can act without consequences." Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, but Emily could hear years of experience behind the words. "Last night was a test to see how you would respond. When you didn't report the assault or leave town, they interpreted that as weakness. Tonight was going to be their next step." Emily felt sick as the implications sank in. "What would have happened if you hadn't moved here?" Sarah's expression was grim. "Nothing good. And it wouldn't have stopped with just you. Predators don't reform themselves, they keep escalating until someone makes them stop." By 3 p.m., Emily had packed her things and reluctantly agreed to spend the night at the Methodist church. Pastor Williams, a kind man in his 60s, didn't ask too many questions when she explained that she felt unsafe in her apartment. He set her up in a small room normally reserved for visiting missionaries and assured her she could stay as long as necessary. Meanwhile, Sarah was conducting final preparations at Emily's apartment. She had positioned cameras to document everything that would happen, tested the lighting to ensure optimal visibility, and prepared several tactical surprises for the brothers' arrival. The apartment's layout favored defense. There was only one entrance, and the narrow stairwell created a natural choke point that would prevent the attackers from using their numerical advantage effectively. Sarah positioned herself where she could control access to the main room while maintaining multiple exit options. At 6 p.m., she settled into wait. In her military career, Sarah had learned that waiting before combat was often the hardest part of any operation. Your mind had time to consider everything that could go wrong, to second-guess your planning, to imagine worst-case scenarios. But she had also learned to use that time productively, running through contingencies and mentally rehearsing her responses. The Hendricks brothers arrived at 9:47 p.m., slightly earlier than Sarah had anticipated but well within the window she had prepared for. She heard their truck pull into the alley behind the building, followed by the sound of doors slamming and hushed voices as they discussed their approach. Sarah activated the recording devices and checked her equipment one final time. Everything was ready. The brothers' voices became clearer as they climbed the external stairs to Emily's apartment. Their conversation confirmed Sarah's assessment of their intentions. "Remember, we're just here to talk," Mike was saying, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Help her understand how things work in this town." "I've got some lessons I'd like to teach her," Jake replied with a laugh that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Keep it quiet until we're inside," Tommy added. "Don't need the whole town knowing our business." Sarah heard them reach the landing outside Emily's door. There was a brief pause, probably while they listened for sounds from inside the apartment. Then came a loud knock. "Miss Chen? This is Mike Hendricks. We need to talk to you about a problem at the school." Sarah almost smiled at the transparent lie. Using Mike's position as a deputy to gain entry was exactly the kind of abuse of authority she had expected. When no one answered, the knocking became more insistent. "We know you're in there, teacher. Open this door right now, or we're going to have to come in the hard way." Sarah counted to 10, then called out in a voice pitched to sound like Emily's. "Just a minute. I'm getting dressed." She heard the brothers chuckling among themselves, clearly interpreting the response as proof that their intimidation tactics were working. "You've got 30 seconds, Mike shouted. "Then, we're coming in anyway." Sarah used those 30 seconds to make final adjustments to her position. When the brothers inevitably broke down the door, they would be silhouetted against the hallway light, temporarily blind as their eyes adjusted to the darker apartment. She would have approximately 3 seconds of complete tactical advantage. The sound of splintering would announce the end of the brothers' patience. The door burst open and all three men crowded into the small apartment, their bulk filling the narrow doorway. "Surprise, teacher!" Jake called out. "Time for that private lesson we talked about." They advanced into the main room, spreading out as their eyes adjusted to the dim lighting. Sarah remained motionless in her concealed position, observing their formation and body language. Mike was clearly the leader, moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Tommy flanked left while Jake moved right, a coordinated pattern that suggested they had done this before. All three were larger than average, clearly strong from ranch work, and comfortable with using physical intimidation. But they moved like civilians, no tactical awareness, no consideration of potential threats, no attention to their rear or flanks. They were focused entirely on finding their intended victim, never considering that the situation might not be what they expected. "Where are you hiding, little teacher?" Tommy called out. "We just want to have a friendly chat." Mike tried the bedroom door and found it locked. "She's probably in here, scared like a little rabbit." "Good," Jake said. "I like it when they are scared. Makes it more fun." Sarah had heard enough. These men were planning to commit sexual assault, and they were discussing it with the casual enthusiasm of people who had done such things before. Any lingering doubts about the necessity of her intervention evaporated. She stepped out of the shadows with the silent precision of a trained operator. "Gentlemen," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the small room. All three men spun around, shock evident on their faces. They had been expecting to find Emily cowering in the bedroom, not a strange woman standing calmly in their path of retreat. "Who the hell are you?" Mike demanded, his hand instinctively moving toward the service weapon on his belt. "I'm someone who doesn't like bullies," Sarah replied, her posture relaxed but ready. "And I'm someone who particularly doesn't like men who threaten women." Jake recovered from his surprise first, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "Look what we got here, boys. Teacher's got herself a friend. 2 for the price of 1. Tommy stepped closer, clearly trying to use his size to intimidate her. "Lady, you picked the wrong night to play hero. Why don't you just walk away and pretend you didn't see anything?" Sarah studied their positions, noting how they had unconsciously arranged themselves in a loose triangle formation. Mike was the primary threat, armed and probably the most experienced fighter. Tommy was closest and would likely be the first to attack. Jake was smaller but positioned to flank her if the situation escalated. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice remaining calm and conversational. "You're going to leave this apartment, drive back to your ranch, and never bother Miss Chen again. You're also going to stop harassing other women in this town." The brothers exchanged glances, then burst into laughter. "Listen, lady," Mike said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is our town. We do what we want, when we want, to whoever we want. And, right now, we want you and your teacher friend to learn some manners." "Last chance," Sarah said simply. Jake took the bait first, lunging forward with the overconfident aggression of someone who had never faced serious resistance. His attack was telegraphed and clumsy, a wild haymaker that left him completely exposed. Sarah sidestepped the punch with minimal effort, grabbed Jake's extended arm, and used his own momentum to drive him face-first into the wall. The impact was sickeningly solid, and Jake crumpled to the floor with blood streaming from his broken nose. Tommy reacted next, pulling a knife from his belt and advancing with slightly more caution than his younger brother had shown. But his technique was that of a brawler, not a trained knife fighter, and his grip was all wrong for serious combat. Sarah waited until he committed to a downward stabbing motion, then stepped inside his reach and trapped his knife arm against her body. A sharp elbow strike to his solar plexus doubled him over, and a knee to his face put him on the ground next to his brother. Mike had finally processed what was happening and was reaching for his service weapon. But his reaction time had been slowed by shock, and his draw was hampered by the confined space and his position relative to his fallen brothers. Sarah covered the distance between them before he could clear the holster. Her hand clamped down on his wrist, preventing him from drawing the weapon, while her other hand found pressure points on his neck that immediately got his attention. "I wouldn't," she said softly, applying just enough pressure to make breathing difficult. "Your brothers are alive, but that can change very quickly if you don't start cooperating." Mike's eyes were wide with a fear he had probably never experienced before. For the first time in his adult life, he was completely powerless, facing someone who could kill him without breaking a sweat. "What do you want?" he gasped. Sarah increased the pressure slightly, watching his face redden as his airway constricted. In her peripheral vision, she could see Tommy stirring on the floor while Jake remained motionless. "I want you to understand that your reign of terror in this town is over," she said, her voice never rising above a conversational tone. "I want you to realize that your victims now have a protector, and that protector has skills you can't imagine." She released the pressure enough to let him speak. Who are you?" "I'm someone who spent 15 years in places where men like you get buried in unmarked graves," Sarah replied. "I'm someone who knows 50 different ways to kill a person with my bare hands. I'm someone who has zero tolerance for sexual predators." The sound of sirens in the distance made Sarah's head turn slightly. Someone had called the police, probably a neighbor who had heard the commotion. She had anticipated this possibility and planned accordingly. "Here's what's going to happen, Deputy Hendricks," she continued, using his title with obvious contempt. "When your fellow officers arrive, you're going to tell them this was all a misunderstanding. You're going to say that you and your brothers came here to apologize for your previous behavior toward Miss Chen, and that you slipped and fell while trying to leave." Mike started to protest, but Sarah's grip on his throat tightened again. "You're going to do this because if you don't, I'm going to start sharing some very interesting photographs and recordings with state authorities, federal authorities, and anyone else who might be interested in a deputy sheriff who breaks into women's apartments with intent to commit sexual assault." Sarah pulled a small digital camera from her pocket, showing Mike the display screen. The images clearly showed all three brothers breaking into the apartment and making threatening statements about their intentions. "I also have audio recordings of your entire conversation outside, including some very graphic descriptions of what you plan to do to Miss Chen tonight." The fight went out of Mike completely as he realized the magnitude of his situation. Not only had he been completely outmatched physically, but Sarah had documented everything. His career, his family's reputation, and his freedom were all hanging by a thread. "What do you want?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "I want you to leave Miss Chen alone permanently. I want you to stop harassing other women in this town. I want you to spread the word that Millfield has new management, and that the old rules no longer apply." Sarah's eyes were cold as winter steel. "And I want you to remember this feeling, this helplessness, this fear, because it's what your victims have been experiencing for years." The sirens were getting closer. Sarah released Mike and stepped back, allowing him to tend to his brothers. Jake was semi-conscious but breathing, while Tommy was sitting up and holding his bloody nose. "One more thing, Deputy," Sarah added as Mike knelt beside his brothers. "If anything happens to Miss Chen, if she has so much as an unpleasant conversation with anyone in your family, I'll assume it's retaliation and respond accordingly. Do we understand each other?" Mike nodded frantically, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. The police arrived 3 minutes later to find 3 men with various injuries claiming they had fallen down while trying to leave the apartment. Their story was obviously false, but without a complainant or witnesses willing to contradict them, there was little the responding officers could do except take statements and suggest everyone involved be more careful in the future. Sarah provided her own statement as a concerned neighbor who had heard noise, and the news of what happened at Emily Chen's apartment spread through Millfield like wildfire, though the details grew more distorted with each retelling. By morning, the official story was that the Hendricks brothers had suffered an unfortunate accident while attempting to apologize to the new teacher. The unofficial story, whispered in coffee shops and passed along in hushed phone calls, suggested something far more dramatic had occurred. Sarah woke early and walked to the diner for breakfast, curious to observe the town's reaction to the previous night's events. The atmosphere was noticeably different. Conversations stopped when she entered, and several patrons studied her with open curiosity. Word had apparently gotten out that a mysterious woman had been present during the accident. Frank Murphy was sitting at his usual corner table, nursing a cup of coffee and reading the local paper. He glanced up as Sarah passed and gave her a knowing nod. As a fellow veteran, he had probably recognized the tactical precision of what had transpired. "Terrible thing about those boys getting hurt last night," Frank said loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Though I suppose everyone needs to be more careful when they are walking around in the dark." Sarah caught the subtle emphasis on careful, and understood that Frank was sending a message to anyone listening. The old Marine had figured out what had really happened and approved. At the counter, Janet the waitress served Sarah's coffee with hands that shook slightly. "You're the one who moved in above Frank's place, right? The one who was there last night when those poor boys had their accident?" "That's right," Sarah replied evenly. "I heard some noise and went to check on my neighbor. Lucky I was there to call for help when they got hurt." Janet's eyes searched Sarah's face, clearly looking for more information about what had really happened. "It's just so strange, you know? Those boys have been walking around this town their whole lives without any accidents. Then, on the same night they go to apologize to Miss Chen, they all end up hurt. Accidents happen when people don't watch where they're going," Sarah said simply, but her tone carried an undertone that made Janet step back slightly. The bell above the diner's door chimed, and Emily entered, looking nervous but determined. She had obviously spent a sleepless night at the church, but there was something different in her bearing, a subtle confidence that hadn't been there before. Emily took a seat at the counter 2 stools away from Sarah, pretending they were strangers. "I heard there was some excitement at my apartment building last night," she said to Janet. "Is everyone okay?" "Oh yes, dear, everyone's fine now," Janet replied, though her voice suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Just some unfortunate accidents. You were smart to stay at the church last night, probably would have been too noisy to sleep with all the commotion." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "Pastor Williams said I can stay there a few more days if needed. He's very concerned about my safety after all the harassment I've been experiencing." This was clearly news to Janet, whose eyes widened with surprise. "Harassment? What kind of harassment?" Sarah had to admire Emily's timing. By raising the harassment issue publicly now, after the brothers' accident, Emily was establishing a clear narrative that their injuries were somehow connected to their previous behavior. Anyone inclined to investigate further would have to consider the possibility that the brothers had been confronted about their actions. It's been going on for weeks, Emily continued, her voice carrying just the right note of distressed vulnerability. Inappropriate comments, following me around town, physical intimidation. I've been too scared to talk about it, but Pastor Williams says I shouldn't have to suffer in silence. Janet's expression shifted from curiosity to sympathy. As a woman who had spent decades working in a small town, she undoubtedly had her own experiences with harassment and understood Emily's situation. That's terrible, honey. Did you report it to Sheriff Watson? Emily's laugh was bitter. Deputy Hendricks is one of the harassers. Along with his brothers. How could I report them to their family friend? The implication hung in the air like a thunderclap. Emily had just publicly accused the deputy sheriff and his brothers of harassment, and she had done it immediately after they suffered mysterious injuries at her apartment building. Even the most naive observer would be able to connect those dots. Janet glanced around the diner, noting how many people were listening to the conversation. This wasn't just gossip anymore, it was a public revelation that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Are you sure about these accusations, Miss Chen? Janet asked quietly. That's a very serious thing to say about the Hendricks family. I have bruises to prove it, Emily replied, pulling up her sleeve to reveal the marks on her arm from where Mike had grabbed her. And I'm not the only woman in this town who's been targeted by them. People have been too afraid to speak up because of their family's influence. Sarah watched the ripple effect of Emily's words spread through the diner. Customers were exchanging meaningful looks, having whispered conversations, and clearly reconsidering everything they thought they knew about the town's power structure. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Watson himself, a heavy-set man in his early 60s who moved with the deliberate pace of someone unaccustomed to dealing with serious crime. He approached Emily with what appeared to be genuine concern. Miss Chen, I heard about the disturbance at your building last night. I wanted to make sure you're okay and find out if you need any additional protection. Sarah had to give the sheriff credit, either he was genuinely unaware of his deputy's extracurricular activities, or he was smart enough to distance himself from the Hendricks family now that their behavior had become a liability. Emily looked the sheriff directly in the eye. Sheriff Watson, I appreciate your concern, but the men who have been harassing me were at my apartment last night. One of them is your deputy. I'm not sure how you can protect me from your own department. The sheriff's face went through several color changes as he processed the implications of Emily's statement. Every person in the diner was now listening intently, and anything he said would be repeated throughout the town within hours. Miss Chen, those are very serious allegations. If you're saying that Deputy Hendricks has been inappropriate in his official capacity, I need to hear the details immediately. Sarah almost smiled at the sheriff's careful phrasing. By focusing on Mike's official capacity rather than his personal conduct, Watson was trying to frame this as a professional misconduct issue rather than a criminal matter. It was a smart political move, but it also suggested he was more concerned about damage control than justice. It wasn't just his official capacity, Emily replied firmly. All three Hendricks brothers have been systematically harassing me for weeks. Yesterday, they physically assaulted me behind the hardware store. Last night, they broke into my apartment while I was away, apparently planning to continue their harassment in private. The sheriff looked genuinely shocked by the escalation Emily was describing. They broke into your apartment? Why wasn't this reported immediately? Because I was afraid, Emily said simply. Because Deputy Hendricks is part of your department, and because everyone in this town knows that crossing the Hendricks family has consequences. Sarah decided it was time to add her voice to the conversation. Sheriff, I was present during last night's incident. I can confirm that the three men broke down Miss Chen's door and entered her apartment without permission. I have photographs and audio recordings that document their statements about their intentions. The sheriff turned to stare at Sarah, clearly trying to figure out who she was and how she fit into this situation. And you are? Sarah Martinez. I live above the hardware store. I heard the commotion and went to investigate. Sarah's voice was calm and professional. I documented everything for Miss Chen's protection, in case she decided to file charges. You have recordings of what happened? I have recordings of the brothers discussing their plans before they entered the apartment, photographs of them forcing entry, and audio of their threatening statements once they were inside. Sarah reached into her pocket and produced the small digital camera. I also have documentation of their injuries, which occurred when they became aggressive and lost their footing in the confined space. Sheriff Watson stared at the camera as if it were a live grenade. The existence of documented evidence changed everything. He could no longer dismiss this as a he said she said situation or rely on the Hendricks family's influence to make the problem disappear. I think we need to continue this conversation in my office, the sheriff said carefully. Miss Chen, Miss Martinez, would you be willing to come in and provide formal statements? Before either woman could respond, the diner's door opened again and Dr. Patricia Patterson entered. The part-time physician had apparently heard about the previous night's events and had come to check on Emily personally. Miss Chen, I heard you might have been injured, Dr. Patterson said, approaching their group. I wanted to make sure you received proper medical attention. Emily looked surprised by the doctor's concern. That's very kind of you, Dr. Patterson. I do have some bruises and sore ribs from yesterday's assault. Dr. Patterson's expression hardened at the word assault. She turned to Sheriff Watson with obvious disapproval. Sheriff, you investigating this assault? Because if a woman in our community has been physically attacked, I expect law enforcement to take it seriously. The sheriff was clearly feeling the pressure from multiple directions now. The town doctor's public support for Emily's story added another layer of credibility to the allegations against his deputy. Dr. Patterson, I'm taking this very seriously. In fact, I was just asking Miss Chen and Miss Martinez to come in and provide formal statements about what happened. Dr. Patterson nodded approvingly. Good. And I'll be conducting a full medical examination of Miss Chen's injuries for your investigation. Assault charges require proper documentation. Sarah watched the dynamics shift in real time as more community members aligned themselves with Emily's version of events. The Hendricks family's influence had been built on fear and silence, but Emily's public courage was inspiring others to speak up. Frank Murphy stood up from his corner table and walked over to join the growing group. Sheriff, if we're talking about harassment in this town, maybe it's time someone mentioned what happened to the Williams family last year. And the Morrison girl. And that woman who tried to open the coffee shop. The sheriff looked increasingly uncomfortable as Frank referenced other incidents that had previously been swept under the rug. Mr. Murphy, if you have information about criminal activity, you should have reported it when it happened. Frank's laugh was dry and bitter. To who? Your deputy who was part of the problem. Sheriff, some of us have been waiting years for someone brave enough to stand up to that family. Now that someone has, maybe we can finally clean up this town. Sarah realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, a community finding its voice after years of intimidation. Emily's courage in speaking publicly about her harassment had given others permission to share their own stories and experiences. But she also knew that the Hendricks family wouldn't go quietly. They had too much to lose and too much invested in the current power structure. Their response to this morning's public humiliation would determine whether the town's liberation would be permanent or temporary. Pastor Williams entered the diner just as the conversation was reaching its peak intensity. The elderly minister looked around at the assembled group with obvious concern. I couldn't help but notice the crowd gathered here, he said diplomatically. I wanted to make sure Miss Chen was all right and offer whatever support the church can provide during this difficult time. Emily stood up and moved closer to the pastor, clearly grateful for his public support. Pastor Williams, I really appreciate everything you've done for me. Staying at the church last night probably saved my life. The pastor's eyebrows rose at Emily's dramatic statement. Saved your life? What exactly happened? Sheriff Watson stepped forward before Emily could respond. Pastor, there seems to have been an incident involving the Hendricks brothers and Miss Chen. I'm conducting an investigation, and I'd prefer not to discuss details publicly until I have all the facts. Pastor Williams studied the sheriff's face carefully. As someone who had counseled troubled families for decades, he had probably developed good instincts about when people were being truthful. Sheriff Watson, if members of my community are in danger, I need to know about it. The church has a responsibility to protect vulnerable people. Dr. Patterson spoke up from beside Emily. Pastor, Miss Chen has been physically assaulted and threatened. She has injuries consistent with deliberate violence, and there's evidence that last night's incident was planned in advance. The minister's expression grew stern. Are you telling me that someone in our community has been attacking a young woman, and this is the first I'm hearing about it? No one wanted to cause trouble, Emily said softly. Everyone told me this was just how things work in small towns. Pastor Williams' face flushed with anger. Attacking innocent people is not how things work in any decent community. Sheriff, I expect a full investigation and appropriate charges filed against whoever is responsible. Sarah could see the sheriff mentally calculating his options. The Hendricks family's counterattack came exactly 72 hours later, just as Sarah had predicted. It began with phone calls to local business owners, reminding them of outstanding loans and suggesting that continued prosperity depended on community loyalty. By noon, several people who had publicly supported Emily at the diner were reconsidering their positions. Sarah observed the pressure campaign from her position at various locations around town, noting who was being targeted and how they responded. Frank Murphy received a visit from the bank president about his mortgage payments. Dr. Patterson was told that her contract with the county health department might not be renewed. Pastor Williams found his church's tax-exempt status being questioned by suddenly motivated county officials. The message was clear: supporting Emily Chen came with serious financial and professional consequences. But the Hendricks family had made a crucial miscalculation. Their heavy-handed retaliation tactics only reinforced Emily's credibility and demonstrated exactly the kind of systematic intimidation she had described. People who might have been willing to dismiss her harassment allegations as misunderstandings could see clear evidence of the family's willingness to abuse their power. Sarah was having coffee at the diner when Sheriff Watson entered, his expression grim and his posture suggesting he was carrying unwelcome news. Miss Martinez, Miss Chen, he said, approaching their table. I need to inform you that there have been some developments in our investigation. Emily looked up nervously. What kind of developments? The Hendricks family has retained legal counsel from the state capitol. Their attorney is claiming that his clients are the victims of a setup, that they were lured to Miss Chen's apartment under false pretenses and, then, assaulted by an unknown attacker. Sarah had anticipated this response. The brothers had probably spent the last 3 days concocting a story that painted them as victims rather than perpetrators. What evidence do they have for these claims? Sarah asked. Sheriff Watson looked uncomfortable. They are saying that Miss Chen arranged for a dangerous associate to ambush them while they were attempting to apologize for previous misunderstandings. They claim they went to her apartment in good faith and were violently attacked without provocation. Emily's face went pale. That's completely false. I was at the church all night, Pastor Williams can confirm it. And they broke down my door. How is that attempting to apologize? According to their attorney, the door was already damaged when they arrived. They claim they entered to check on Miss Chen's safety and were attacked by someone who was lying in wait. Sarah had to admire the legal strategy, even as she despised its dishonesty. The brothers were reframing the encounter as a criminal conspiracy against them, which would put Emily and Sarah on the defensive and shift attention away from the harassment allegations. Sheriff, Sarah said calmly, I assume you'll be reviewing the photographic and audio evidence I mentioned. The recordings clearly show their intentions and contradict their current claims. Sheriff Watson's expression grew even more troubled. That's another problem. The Hendricks attorney is questioning the legality of any recordings made without proper warrants or consent. He's suggesting that the evidence might not be admissible. Sarah had expected this challenge as well. The recordings were made in defense of a potential crime victim, in a location where the perpetrators had no reasonable expectation of privacy after breaking and entering. Any competent prosecutor should be able to establish their admissibility. The problem is finding a prosecutor willing to take on the Hendricks family, Sheriff Watson admitted. The county district attorney has recused himself due to potential conflicts of interest. The state attorney general's office says they're too busy to handle what they consider a local matter. The pieces of the Hendricks family's counterattack were falling into place. They were using their political connections to ensure that no prosecutor would be willing or able to bring charges against them, while simultaneously portraying themselves as victims of a criminal conspiracy. Emily looked devastated by this turn of events. So they are just going to get away with everything? All of this was for nothing? Not necessarily, Sarah said quietly. They're making the same mistake that many powerful people make. They're assuming that legal maneuvering is the only form of accountability that matters. Sheriff Watson studied Sarah's expression carefully. Miss Martinez, I hope you're not considering any kind of vigilante justice. That would only make things worse for everyone involved. Sarah's smile was cold but not threatening. Sheriff, I'm a law-abiding citizen. But I'm also someone who believes that truth has a way of coming to light, regardless of legal technicalities. That evening, Sarah put the final phase of her plan into motion. She had spent the last 3 days gathering additional intelligence about the Hendricks family's business operations, their personal relationships, and their various vulnerabilities. What she had discovered was a network of corruption, intimidation, and abuse that extended far beyond their harassment of Emily. Using skills developed during intelligence operations in hostile territories, Sarah began systematically documenting and exposing the family's activities. She created detailed dossiers on their financial dealings, their abuse of public office, and their pattern of targeting vulnerable community members. Then, she began distributing this information through channels that the Hendricks family couldn't control or intimidate. The first leak went to investigative journalists at the state capitol, complete with documented evidence and corroborating sources. The second went to federal authorities who handled civil rights violations and abuse of power cases. The third went to social media activists who specialized in exposing small-town corruption. But Sarah's masterstroke was her fourth target, the military justice system. Deputy Mike Hendricks had served briefly in the Army National Guard before returning home to join his father's business empire. His service record contained several disciplinary actions that had been covered up through family influence, but, more importantly, his current behavior as a law enforcement officer reflected poorly on his military service. Sarah contacted her former commanding officers and provided detailed documentation of Mike's abuse of power, criminal behavior, and dishonor to the uniform he had once worn. The military took a very dim view of former service members who brought disgrace to the armed forces, and they had resources for investigation and accountability that local officials couldn't influence. Within 48 hours, the story exploded beyond Millfield's borders. Local news became regional news, which became state news, which eventually caught the attention of national outlets interested in stories about small-town corruption and abuse of power. The Hendricks family suddenly found themselves facing scrutiny from multiple directions simultaneously. Federal investigators arrived to examine civil rights violations. State authorities began reviewing their business licenses and government contracts. Military investigators started questioning Mike's fitness to remain in the reserves. Most importantly, the national attention made it impossible for local officials to continue protecting the family. The county district attorney found himself forced to assign a special prosecutor, while the state attorney general's office announced a comprehensive investigation into systematic corruption in rural law enforcement. Sarah watched the family's empire crumble with the same methodical satisfaction she had felt watching enemy positions fall during military operations. The brothers had believed their local influence made them untouchable, but they had underestimated the power of modern communications and federal oversight. Emily found Sarah at the diner exactly 1 week after the national story broke. "I wanted to thank you," Emily said, sliding into the booth across from her. "Not just for protecting me that night, but for everything that came after. You've given this whole town its courage back." Sarah nodded acknowledgement but remained focused on the practical details. "How are you doing?" Any more harassment or retaliation? Nothing. Complete silence from the Hendricks family and everyone connected to them. It's like they've suddenly discovered the concept of appropriate boundaries. Emily's smile was genuinely happy for the first time since Sarah had met her. Dr. Patterson says the pressure on her contract has disappeared. Pastor Williams got an apology from the county about the tax audit. Even Frank Murphy's mortgage problems mysteriously resolved themselves. The systematic withdrawal of intimidation tactics confirmed that the Hendricks family understood how completely their situation had changed. They were now focused on damage control and legal survival rather than maintaining their local dominance. What about the criminal charges? Sarah asked. The special prosecutor filed assault, harassment, and civil rights violation charges against all three brothers yesterday. Mike's been suspended from the sheriff's department pending the outcome of multiple investigations. Emily's voice carried a note of amazement. 6 months ago, I never would have imagined any of this was possible. Sarah had seen similar transformations in communities around the world where entrenched power structures had been successfully challenged. Once people realized that change was possible, momentum built quickly and comprehensively. Have you decided whether to stay in Millfield? Sarah asked. Emily considered the question carefully. I think I will. This place needs good teachers, and I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought. Besides, I have friends here now, people who stood up for me when it mattered. Sarah understood the appeal of staying in a community where you had fought for positive change. There was satisfaction in seeing the results of your courage and sacrifice playing out in real time. Over the following months, Sarah watched Millfield transform into something resembling a normal small town. New businesses opened without being subjected to the Hendricks family's approval process. Families with teenage daughters began moving back to the area. The high school hired additional teachers and started offering programs that had been eliminated years earlier due to budget constraints that mysteriously disappeared along with the family's influence. Mike Hendricks pleaded guilty to civil rights violations and resigned from law enforcement. Tommy and Jake faced multiple felony charges and were looking at significant prison time. Their father lost several government contracts after investigators discovered evidence of bid rigging and kickbacks. Most importantly, the culture of fear that had dominated the community for decades was replaced by something Sarah recognized from the best military units she had served, with a sense of collective responsibility and mutual protection. Emily thrived in the new environment, becoming not just a teacher but a community leader who worked to ensure that vulnerable people had support and protection. She established a crisis hotline, organized self-defense classes, and created support networks for anyone facing harassment or abuse. 6 months after the confrontation at Emily's apartment, Sarah was preparing to leave Millfield. She had accomplished what she came there to do, she had found a purpose again, had made a meaningful difference, and had helped a community reclaim its integrity. Emily found her packing boxes in her small apartment above the hardware store. "You're really leaving?" Emily asked, though she had clearly expected this moment. "It's time," Sarah replied simply. "You don't need protection anymore, and this place doesn't need an outsider keeping watch. You've learned to take care of yourselves." Emily sat down on the couch where Sarah had first examined her injuries all those months ago. "Where will you go?" Sarah had been thinking about that question for weeks. There were other small towns in America where good people were being intimidated by local bullies, other places where someone with her skills and experience could make a difference. There's a place in Montana where a veteran's widow is being harassed by developers who want her land. Another situation in Georgia where a whistleblower is facing retaliation for reporting corruption. The world is full of people who need someone to stand up for them. Emily smiled through tears she was trying not to shed. "So you're going to be like a traveling guardian angel?" Sarah laughed at the description. "More like a very specialized consultant. I help communities solve as facing pressure from multiple respected community members to investigate his own deputy, and he had documented evidence of criminal activity that he couldn't ignore. The political safe play was to distance himself from the Hendricks family and side with the growing coalition supporting Emily. I assure all of you that I take these allegations very seriously," Sheriff Watson said formally. "I'll be conducting a thorough investigation, and, if evidence supports criminal charges, I'll file them regardless of who's involved." It was exactly the kind of non-committal statement Sarah had expected, but it represented progress. The sheriff was at least publicly acknowledging that the allegations would be investigated, which was more than Emily had hoped for just days earlier. As the group began to disperse, Sarah caught Emily's eye and gave her a subtle nod of approval. The young teacher had handled the public revelation brilliantly, turning her personal trauma into a catalyst for community change. But Sarah also noticed several patrons who had remained conspicuously silent during the conversation, people who were probably connected to the Hendricks family either financially or socially. The battle for Millfield's soul was far from over, and the other side would be planning their counterattack. The real test would come when the Hendricks family recovered from their shock and began fighting back with all the resources at their disposal. Sarah had won the first engagement, but the war was just beginning. "Come to investigate." She expressed sympathy for the brothers' unfortunate accident and hoped they would recover quickly from their injuries. By midnight, the apartment was quiet again. Sarah spent the next hour cleaning up any evidence of her preparations and ensuring that her cameras and recording devices were safely stored. The brothers' version of events would be the official record, but Sarah's documentation would be her insurance policy. She had sent a message tonight that would spread through Millfield faster than wildfire. The Hendricks brothers had met their match, and everyone in town would know it by morning. More importantly, Emily was safe, and other potential victims would be protected by the new reality Sarah had created. As she settled down to sleep in the chair by the window, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She had found a purpose again, something worth fighting for in a world that had taken everything else away from her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, justice had been served. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, but it wasn't entirely from fear. For the first time since arriving in Millfield, she felt like she might not be completely helpless. "What do you need me to do?" But Sarah also understood that this wasn't a military operation. She couldn't simply neutralize the threat and move on. This was a civilian community with complex social dynamics, and any action she took would have long-term consequences for Emily and other potential victims. As they climbed the stairs to her apartment, Sarah was already formulating a plan. It would require patience, careful observation, and precise execution. The Hendricks brothers thought they controlled this town through fear and intimidation. They were about to learn that their methods only worked against people who had something to lose. Sarah Martinez had already lost everything that mattered to her. She had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The Hendricks brothers had picked the wrong person to mess with, and they had chosen the wrong town to terrorize. They just didn't know it yet.